Well, hello. Today we're in Acts 15, which means you are well into your third week of doing devotions. And I hope it's becoming a habit. I hope it's something you look forward to now every day, every morning, if that's your time, or every evening. And so let's go into Acts 15, which is a very important chapter. You see, the Christian church was in danger of splitting into two factions, the Jewish church and the Gentile church. Remember now, the Gentiles had never grown up with any of the Jewish traditions. They'd never participated in the Jewish feasts, never been to the temple. They didn't even know Jewish history. The Jews, however, had grown up surrounded by all of that. And so the Jews had a question. Think of how much of that Jewish tradition did they need to carry forward into their new Christian faith? Think about wheat. We know that wheat has a kernel that is surrounded by a husk that protects the wheat while it's developing until harvest time. And so the Jews wondered just how much of what we have been practicing for centuries is husk that can just be eliminated now that Jesus Christ has come. And how much of that is actually kernel, that's eternal, that we must protect. And so that was the issue facing the church. Now, to us 2,000 years later, it seems clear what parts of the Old Testament covenant we haven't carried forward. For instance, obviously the dietary laws, the sacrificial laws, and much more. But to the first century Jewish Christian, these were issues they were still trying to figure out. Now, how exactly do you transition from being an Old Covenant believer to a New Covenant believer? And central to this issue was the issue of circumcision, which is the central sign to the Old Covenant, just as baptism is to us in the New Testament. And the underlying question was, did a Gentile have to first become a Jew before they could be a Christian? Now, in chapter 15, at the very beginning, these issues come to a head because some Jewish believers from Jerusalem come up to Antioch. And they begin teaching the people that they must all be circumcised and follow all of the Jewish laws. And so there's a great debate with Paul and Barnabas taking the opposite position. They cannot resolve this debate, and so they decide to send a contingent down to Jerusalem, after all these teachers had come from Jerusalem, to decide, is that really what the Jerusalem church's position is? And so they sent down a contingent. Paul and Barnabas are there, and they arrive, and Paul begins to talk about the wonderful things that God is doing among the Gentile believers. And then, once again, the question erupts. Verse 5, we read this. But some of the sect of the Pharisees who had believed stood up, saying, "It is necessary to circumcise them and to direct them to observe all the laws of Moses." And so here the Pharisees that have been converted to Christianity stood up. Now, remember, the Pharisees, unlike the Sadducees, they believed in a coming Messiah, and they believed in the resurrection of the righteous. Therefore, it was easy for them to accept that Jesus was the Messiah and that he was in fact resurrected from the dead. And they did this, and many of them still held on to their Pharisaical legalism. And so this debate goes on, and so Peter stands up and he makes the point that this issue has already been decided when God sent him to preach the gospel to Cornelius, who was, of course, a Gentile. So let's pick up his argument in verse 7. After there had been much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, "Brethren, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you that by my mouth the Gentiles would hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, who knows the heart, testified to them, giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he also did to us. And he made no distinction between us and them, cleansing their hearts by faith." He made the point that God did not require Cornelius to become a Jew and take on all the Jewish laws, but that God accepted Cornelius by faith. Next, Paul stands up and he begins to relate how this is exactly what's happening in Antioch. The Holy Spirit is being poured out among the Gentiles. Now, at this point, James stands up. Now, this is not the Apostle James, one of the 12, the brother of John. We already know that in, I believe it was Acts chapter 12, he was martyred. This is James, the brother of Jesus. Jesus appeared uniquely to James, so he was, if you will, called to this position of authority. He was a man of great righteousness. He was known as a man of great wisdom, and so he was highly regarded, and people listened to him when he spoke. Let's read what he said. He said, "Brethren, listen to me," beginning in verse 14. "Simon has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. And then he says, therefore it is my judgment that we do not trouble those who are turning to God from among the Gentiles, but that we write to them that they, here it comes, they abstain from things contaminated by idols, and from fornication, and from what is strangled, and from blood." And so he essentially only sets three requirements in front of the Gentile believers. First of all, that they are not to eat things sacrificed to idols. If you know the ancient world, you know that all the different guilds, we would call them like unions or organizations, whether they were the carpenters or the butchers or the merchant class, they all had temples that they belonged to. Each of these guilds had their own idols, their own false gods that they worshiped and that they sacrificed to, and that they had their meals together. So this was to keep the Gentiles from falling back into their old patterns and consorting with demons who are behind the idols. The second one was the prohibition against fornication. Now, it's interesting to realize that in the whole Greek world, only the Jewish religion taught that sex was to be kept within the bounds of marriage between a man and a woman. The rest of their society was wildly pagan. Anything that we encounter in this country right now is just tame compared to what was going on there. And so there was a real concern that if we just let the law go and let the Gentiles come in without the Jewish law, how are we going to keep their pagan, their sexual immorality out of the church? And then the third one was interesting, and that is eating meat with blood in it. So that takes care of two. That's also why they couldn't eat things that were strangled, because those animals weren't bled. Now, the first time we come across this prohibition is to Noah in Genesis 9, when he comes out of the ark. And God says that he cannot eat meat that has its blood in it. And the reason for this, we're told throughout the Mosaic Law, in Leviticus 17:11, for instance, that the life is in the blood. If you think about it, your blood carries the nutrients, it carries the oxygen. If you lose too much blood, you die. Giving blood is called giving the gift of life. And so blood was sacred because life was sacred. Only God could take life. Therefore, human beings were not to take blood because that represented life, which was God's prerogative. Now, all three of these rules were already held to be binding on all human beings, even those who weren't Jews. And so a letter was put together, it was sent to Antioch, it was read, and there was great rejoicing going on, because what that meant was that the church would remain united. There wouldn't be two churches divided. And this chapter then ends with Paul and Silas leaving for their second missionary journey, and we'll pick that up in the very next chapter.